Welcome to Pete's Property Podcast, brought to you by Buyers and hosted by Pete Wargent, buyer's agent, finance and real estate expert, and all-round property guru, plus published author. Join Pete for 30 minutes as he chats all things property with a new guest each week. Learn practical tips from the movers and shakers in the property industry and well-known personalities sharing their property journeys.
G'day, welcome to the Pete Wargent Property Pod, and this week I'm delighted to have Market Economics MD, Mr. Stephen Koukoulas. Kouk, it's great to have you back on.
Pete, lovely to see you. Looking forward to seeing you in real life rather than through the Zoom camera.
I know, it almost feels surreal, doesn't it, to be actually making plans for coffee catch-ups and people going to pubs and bars again. Been a while, but looks like we're in the home stretch now, so really looking forward to that and seeing some of the Australian summer, and hopefully in England, Ashes win, but I won't be holding my breath.
That's the biggest issue for the next couple of months, the Ashes. Can't wait.
Yeah, it's been a while between drinks. So today we're going to talk about the outlook for 2022. So who better than your good self to give us an overview and some detail on what you're seeing for the year ahead. So firstly, let's talk about the economy broadly. So we just had the figures for Q3. Obviously, it's always sort of old news by the time you get the figures and it's almost in the rear view mirror. But the economy shrank by a couple of percent or a bit less in the September quarter, not maybe as bad as we feared. And I'm sensing you're thinking that the rebound should be pretty good.
Yeah, look, I'm an optimist, and in fact, while it sort of seems funny in a way to get exuberant and excited about GDP when it drops 1.9% in a quarter, we know that New South Wales, Victoria, the ACT were pretty much locked down completely through that whole period. Interstate borders were still largely closed. So, we, the Reserve Bank, Treasury, everyone in the financial markets that I'm aware of was forecasting a bigger decline. So, in a sense, there was a fair bit of resilience in that quarter. And we do know from the partial indicators for the December quarter, October retail sales and things like that, it's going to be strong. So the rebound's going to be strong. But that's more noise around COVID, Delta lockdowns, these sorts of things. But for 2022, look, I'm pretty upbeat still. I think that Delta just really put a pause in that growth momentum that we saw through the first half of 2021, which, if we remember, was pretty good. We're getting the unemployment rate down below 5%, and there was tentative evidence that wages were picking up. So that pause, or the air pocket, whatever you want to call it, in Q3 will pass. And if you look at what's going to drive the economy in 2022, it's us consumers. We've got plenty of cash. We're still saving lots of money on our mortgage repayments, with the Reserve Bank keeping interest rates low for the time being, at least for a little while longer. We look at the CapEx expectations from business. So business investment's going to be very buoyant. There's a big pent-up demand for machinery and equipment investment, even building and structures. So maybe not CBD office towers, but warehouses and these sorts of things are going to be part of 2022 that's going to be strong. A little bit of a drag. We do know that dwelling construction's coming off a little. The building approvals numbers have tapered down since the stimulus measures in late 2020, early 2021. So, dwelling construction's probably going to be a bit weaker in 2022. And probably exports down a bit too. We do know that part of that CapEx pickup will be flooded by imports. So your net export calculation, doing a GDP calculation, will probably be a bit negative. So bottom line, in all of that, GDP growth, a really solid 5.5% through 2022. That triggers a decline in the unemployment rate back into the mid 4%, maybe lower, probably lower in fact, if you look at the job ads and job vacancies series. So it's a good year ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's been a long while since we've been able to talk about strong GDP growth figures. And yes, for sure, coming off a lower base because of the lockdown. But it does look as though with all that cash sitting around, the economy can grow quite nicely. Plus, we've got a couple of 100,000 people who are eligible to come back in fairly soon in terms of international students and skilled workers. And we'll come on to what's going to happen to immigration in just a moment. But just you touched on an interesting point there. If the economy rebounds quickly as you expect, do you think we will start to see interest rates rising sooner than might previously been expected?
Yeah, look, the RBA is quite adamant. No, they're wanting to sort of keep monetary policy, certainly official interest rates, where they are until they're absolutely confident that inflation's well entrenched in the upper half, actually, of their 2 to 3% inflation band. To get there, you need wages growth to be picking up to sort of 3.5, actually, not just 3. It's got to be 3.5, I think, with a measurement allowance for productivity and these sorts of things. And, we're still a long way from that on the hard data that we've got. So one part of me says, look, okay, the RBA does want to sort of make amends for that period of inflation undershooting in the last 5 years or so. And that's fair enough. It's actually a legitimate thing and it's a good thing. However, I reckon, again, we're looking at the recent US labour market data, UK labour market data, our friends across the Tasman in New Zealand, already they're printing unemployment rates in the low 4s or thereabouts, in quite incredibly strong labour data. I think we're just a little behind because our delta impacted our economy more adversely than those other economies, or New Zealand accepted. But, I reckon that there's a very strong probability that through March, April, May, June, that middle part of next year, once we sort of got the dust settling as the rebound occurs from Delta, we could be getting an unemployment rate lower earlier. If any of these anecdotes that I keep hearing from every person and their dog, that their wages are picking up, if that does actually show up in the hard wages data in the next couple of quarters. So, let's fast forward to May, June-ish, something like that. The next couple of quarters show wages growth of, 0.9 quarter on quarter. That's very high. You're all of a sudden getting this inflation pressure that the RBA would have to recast. So, okay, the futures market's got a couple of little rate hikes priced in 2022. I think that's about right. There could be more actually, but the RBA does want to resist at this stage. It wants to get that inflation rate and wages growth back up.
Yeah, so that's another thing we haven't been able to talk about really since the mining boom years is the prospect of wages actually growing at a decent pace again. We've had almost a decade of relatively low wages growth in Australia. I suppose we were coming off the back of a really strong period and then things perhaps inevitably normalised after the mining boom peaked. Potential for interest rates to go up as well. Now, I mentioned just before there with the international students and 50,000 skilled workers having the eligibility to come back to Australia. Now, it might take some time for them to get in because of, there's still some restrictions in place. I think as well, flight availability, more pertinently, might mean it's a while before all of those people filter through. I suppose just a bigger picture question, though. In 2019, Scott Morrison reduced the migration cap to 160,000 per annum in Australia, just to allow infrastructure to catch up. And I think we were struggling, I guess, for a while there with very, very high rates of immigration. Now there's talk from the New South Wales Premier and some of the business councils are pushing for the cap to be increased again to 200,000 per annum to alleviate the skills shortage. I suppose the one thing that we talked about when we were on last time a few weeks ago is that if you went back a couple of years ago and the immigration stopped and we had all of these buildings going up, particularly detached housing all around the country, we all kind of assumed there'd be this big oversupply or overhang of houses. And it just, for whatever reason, hasn't happened. You suggested maybe a lot of people buying second homes and so on. So those properties just not making it to the rental market. So what do you think might happen to immigration settings next year? And what do you think should happen to immigration next year?
Yeah, look, a couple of things about immigration. It is a good thing. We do want immigration, but like the analogy I use, and I've used it before, but like good red wine, there's an optimal amount, and if you have too much, you're left with a nasty hangover. And I think pre-COVID, when we had that period from roughly 2012-13 through to 2019-ish, we had really high immigration, and as you alluded to, it created congestion in the cities because, again, where do most immigrants live? Sydney, Melbourne, to some extent Brisbane, and we hadn't built the public sector transport infrastructure, for example, to cope with it. And when the land release, the urban sprawl was occurring, and so you could say, well, they're building lots of houses. It was in areas where people didn't really want to live, the transport, the schools, the work, these sorts of things that people want to sort of live near the amenity, let's call it, wasn't quite right. So getting back to your point, that look, some immigration is important. We've got to get foreign students back into our universities. That's really, the university sector's been decimated or worse over this period. So, of course, that's a really important part of our recovery process. But then the question comes about that on discretionary immigration. What's the optimal level? I think it should be a little bit lower for a little bit longer. Let the infrastructure build itself, maintain sort of construction activity so that we don't run into these capacity constraints. And congestion is a capacity constraint, clearly, on roads and things like that. So very hard to pinpoint the number, but you know when you've got too much, and you can probably tell when you've got too little. So given the track record, the number of permanent immigrants should be lower than it was pre-COVID, but I'm not quite sure how strong it'll be. And as you said, it'll be more of a trickle as people start to sort of work out, can they come back? What are the border restrictions? The skill shortage. So I know a lot of businesses are putting their dibs in for skilled workers in their industry. So they're trying to sort of lobby the powers that be to get their skill set sort of satisfied. So absolutely fascinating. But immigration, really important thing, but just not too much too quickly.
Yeah, and of course, with the population living longer, we've got a natural growth in the population anyway. Plus, we've got a relatively young population in Australia, certainly compared to most developed countries. So there's a lot of people coming in to those sort of key working age ranges just because of the natural growth of the population. And you throw in another 160,000 per annum. It's a lot of, that's still going to be population around 600,000 bigger over the next couple of years, even without an increase in the cap. So add in some returning expats, maybe we don't need to increase that cap, maybe let wages growth go up for a period of time, which we haven't seen for a long time now. Observing with interest, well, from afar, I've been observing with interest because I haven't been to Sydney or Melbourne now for over a year. But I've read a lot about empty office space, and I certainly noticed on the stock markets in 2020, some of the property trusts on the stock market got absolutely walloped and then subsequently bounced as people realised that the world maybe wasn't going to end. But it does seem at the moment that we need less commercial office space employee. What do you think might happen when the borders reopen and as we get the vaccinations rolled out in full? Do you think we'll go back to normal, or do you think there might be some changes over the medium term?
I'm more inclined to think that we'll go back to sort of normal, because I think people, while they've enjoyed working from home to a point, do value both the professional interaction over the proverbial coffee machine, if you like, and just being in an office where you can shoot the breeze on an issue. Okay, you can do it from home with a Zoom meeting or a phone call. Of course you can. But I think people, and in more particularly their bosses, like people to be in the office a little bit more. So it may not be the 5 days a week from 8 till 6 or whatever it is, but I think there'll be some sizable return. Whether it won't be back to 100% quickly, but there'll be some move back. And again, not everybody can work from home, even in the sort of office jobs. They do need some sort of contact with other workers that you can't necessarily always do over a computer. So I think it'll come back a bit. Now, obviously, some people have taken the decision to work from home, and their new home is in a rural and regional part of the country. One part that I like looking at for a whole host of reasons is the Tasmanian housing market. And my goodness, Hobart and Launceston, two lovely cities, small but fantastic. I must confess I've seen the Hobart prices come through CoreLogic and other measures, but I confess I haven't looked at Launceston. But having looked at Launceston house prices for the last 3 or 4 years, I reckon they're massively strong. Why? People are going there for lifestyle choices. I can work from there. It's got an airport to Melbourne and Sydney, when they're open. And so you sort of see, so are people going to go back to the CBD to work? Yes, but I think a lot of people won't as well. So I'm giving a 2-bob each way answer here. But there will be some return to the city, but I think that the change of some people, if you're a writer or an analyst who requires spreadsheets and things, you can do that sitting anywhere. And I think that trend's going to continue for many employers, and that lifestyle choice. The early retirement is another thing that I think is an important thing, that people perhaps look at the value of their house and think, geez, my house is worth an absolute fortune now. I can buy something probably better for half the price if I do go to Tasmania or regional New South Wales and Victoria and pocket a couple of $1 million and just work from home to keep myself busy.
Yeah, we've certainly seen plenty of that in southeast Queensland. Noosa, where we are, I mean, there's effectively no stock for rent. There's just nothing available because there's been a big shift, particularly from Victoria, which I guess had longer lockdowns than any other state. So Gold Coast, I understand, is pretty much the same dynamic. And I guess there's a lot of that sort of people choosing to go for the lifestyle and coastal locations. I think I've done a lot of reading on the subject, and I think the optimists' take is that if you look at the CapEx plans, businesses are hiring again. Their job ads are, 13-year highs, and there's expansion plans in place. And some are saying we might actually need more employees for the CBDs as investment rebounds after this sort of, we've had 2 years effectively of nothing. Yeah, I mean, it feels like at the moment, the each way bet is probably some kind of a hybrid model, maybe more businesses using hubs or potentially retaining office space, but maybe having more sort of meeting rooms or collaboration spaces and conference rooms, that kind of thing. Employees have got the balance of power a bit more now, so maybe they'll be demanding a bit more in terms of their own sort of health and space and sort of employee well-being. So that might be a bit more in focus. I did see as well the other day one of the big Singapore investment trusts mopping up some prime office towers in Sydney. So clearly some of the smart money thinks we're going back to the office. It's just a question of how long and how much, I guess.
And how it functions. No, I think you're right. So maybe rather than a bet each way, maybe you're quite right. It is a structural change in the composition of where we work and even how we work. So it might not be it's not one or other. It could be a little bit of both that's happening. I think I think you made a really good point there. That's probably a bit of both. So
let's get your sort of outlook for the housing market. Now, we were actually chatting before we came on and started recording. You've been around the traps a bit this week. First time in a while, been allowed to travel. And certainly in some of those sort of peri-urban locations, not in the capital cities, but on the fringes or within sort of reasonable striking distance, we've seen a massive run-up in some of those markets. More space, more lifestyle, cheaper entry prices. So potentially there's some overheating in some markets. But what do you think for the housing market overall in 2022?
Yeah, look, I look after what's happened this last 18 months or so, because the low point, if I recall, in prices was September 2020. So here we are in December 21, so it's been, 15, 16 months. Yeah, prices have been staggering. And the interesting thing, or the incredible thing, is it's been broadly based. Sure, some areas have done better than others, but basically there aren't many weak pockets in the Australian property market at all. So I didn't think it would be this strong. I put my hand up and certainly didn't forecast that, even though interest rates were low and there are the supply side issues that we alluded to a moment ago. A lot of construction going on right now, no population growth or very limited population growth. So I'm still a believer in supply and demand dynamics. And again, my canary in the coal mine for analysing Australian property is Perth. It's my favourite market. And we do know that Perth's WA population has been very, very weak. They've closed their borders. They've been the most rigid of any of the state or territory governments. And Perth's actually, I won't call it weakening, but from not a very strong base over the past decade, it's sort of faltered in the last couple of months. If you look at the CoreLogic monthly or even weekly sort of price data, it's just stalled. Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra and Brisbane's on fire. They're still increasing 1, 2, 2.5, whatever percent per month. Perth's 0.1, 0.2. Why? It tells me that supply and demand does still take precedence over most other things. So for 2022, look, my hunch is that house prices do taper. They do start to stall. They do start to come off a bit, even with the opening of the borders and immigration coming back into the economy. You've got still an oversupply or a large construction pipeline coming onto the market that has to impact supply at some stage, whether it's supply in advertisements on realestate.com.au or somewhere else, I'm not sure yet, but that supply has to filter into the market at some stage. And maybe people have got buying their second and third properties out of their systems. They've got that sort of mortgage calculator, I'm going to buy a house type reaction coming through when they've been sitting at home. So I'm wondering whether we're just going to get a bit of a faltering in prices. Look, almost never a crash person. I don't think we're going to have a crash, but I just think that maybe some sticker shock as well, that people do actually shy away when they see even modest sort of properties going for an incredible price. They'll say, look, I'm going to rent a little bit longer. And so some demand sort of tapers off as well. So, of course, it depends city to city, but the Australia-wide price is down 5% through 2022. The interest rate issue, we know that some fixed rate mortgages have gone up. They're probably going to start to come down again, given what's happened in financial markets this last week or two. But so interest rate discussions anyway cause a few frighteners amongst people. So just that scenario where prices, they've had an incredible run up, they probably top out and might just come off a bit. Now, nothing to worry about, but just come down 5% or something through 2022.
Do you want to save on buyer's agent fees? You could save thousands with Buyers Buyers. As Australia's most extensive network of buyer's agents, we can lock in highly competitive prices. Plus, our national network of buyer's agents are some of the best in the business. So get the Buyers Buyers advantage and talk to us today. Call 1800 975 051 or visit buyersbuyers.com.au.
Just in the last 2 months, there's just more choice now. There was a real shortage of properties for sale, and at last, not so much in Canberra, I might add, but certainly in Sydney and Melbourne, the people are feeling confident enough to actually go through an auction campaign or a listing campaign now. Now we're getting pretty tight into Christmas at the time of recording, so that window might be closing, but there's certainly been a lot more supply, and the auctions have been very, very high for a couple of weeks. So my final question, Kouk, I know you've always got your finger on the political pulse, being a former Labor man as well. So obviously election year coming up. So anything that sort of impacts or policies which might have an impact on the housing market? And I suppose at the moment, it's probably harder than ever to make hard predictions with everything that's been going on around the world. But any sort of X-factor predictions for next year?
Yeah, look, on the politics, Labor have started to release a few of their policies. They realise they've got to be seen as an alternative government. They're ahead in the polls. I think just recently the latest news poll has them ahead 53-47. Not that we know that those polls are terribly reliable in any part of the world. People are a bit more fickle, I think, when it comes to voting versus what they actually say to the pollsters. But you've got to say Labor have got it's going to be a very close race as far as we can tell from this distance. So Labor's putting out their policies. On the housing front, they've been pretty quiet. The negative gearing changes that they took to 2019, the capital gains tax changes they took have been jettisoned. They're not going to be part of their agenda. They have indicated that they're fans of building additional social housing, so they're going to have a housing infrastructure fund to build low-cost, affordable housing and emergency housing for people in crisis conditions. And that's more social policy, I'd argue, than housing policy, if you like, even though it is housing. But on the housing front, Jason Falinski, has conducted an inquiry into housing affordability. His committee's reporting sometime soon. And again, the arguments, there have been some really terrific submissions put there from a lot of really clever people and stimulating a huge debate, but I don't know if it leads to anything. Really interesting reading, but whether it causes the politicians, Labor or Liberal, to change their view on housing, I'm not really sure. I think it's going to be an election that comes back to sort of broad macroeconomics, who's better at running the economy, however you define that. It's going to be, budget deficits, heaven forbid, and these sorts of things that are going to be there, and we'll see which way we vote. And of course, climate issues are important, and a lot of independents seem to be coming out of the woodwork to sort of contest what were formerly quite safe seats. So if they can actually snag a few seats, we could be in for a hung parliament. So that sort of stuff. Factor X's, look, my Factor X is that we actually do have that scenario where the RBA hikes earlier than is currently thought of, and certainly what they're thinking, that we do get that wage and inflation pressures. It's what was, even we've seen the Fed sort of moderate their transitory view on inflation. It looks to be a bit more entrenched. So my X factor, it's not that big an X factor, I suppose, is that by the middle of 2022, we do see underlying inflation at 3%. The highest it's been in, that'll be 15 years or so. That we do see wages growth. These anecdotes do show up in the hard official wages data, and they're 3.5. So in a sense, those numbers aren't frightening, but compared with what the RBA is forecasting and what they're thinking and what their forward guidance to the market is right now, they would be X factors that would probably see that rate hiking cycle kick off around the middle of 2022, maybe the third quarter of 2022. And we do maybe get the official cash rate being hiked, I don't know, 100 basis points or 150 basis points over 18 months or so. And that would be a huge issue for the housing market because, of course, I think with the household debt levels being the way they are, the bigger they are, the more sensitive they are to small changes in rates. And I think that would be an issue that would perhaps filter into sort of a bit of a breather from this housing price surge that we've seen.
Yeah, sign of the times, isn't it? Talking about a cash rate going to 1%. Actually, it's a long time since we've talked about interest rates actually going up. There was a lot of talk about it a few years ago, but it never really happened. And then the sort of long 30-year downtrend has just carried on and on and on. And finally, we're starting to talk about rate hikes again. And yeah, as you said, a lot of households would have even seen interest rate hikes in their lifetimes. So new borrowers are being stress tested now with a 3% buffer. So theoretically, there's a bit of headroom there. But as you say, just even the fact that rates going higher can actually sort of cause a change in sentiment. So I guess summing up, you're thinking wages growth actually getting a bit stronger, potentially 5% or more growth in the economy, which is good. Immigration kicking off again, but hopefully not too high a level for your liking. Yeah. Maybe just a bit of cooling in the housing market as more people actually look to sell and the market's just calming down a bit potentially if interest rates go up. So it doesn't sound too bad overall. It'd be a few changes of direction there after everything going one way for some time. As you mentioned just before, it won't be too long before we can actually catch up in person, which will be a bit weird after all this time on Zoom and Skype and all these other virtual meeting rooms. So I'm really looking forward to that as well.
Yep, that's a great summary. So yes, I'm pretty upbeat. I'm optimistic about the economy in 2022, even if housing does cool off a bit. In a funny way, we don't want house prices to go up 20% every year for eternity. That doesn't work. First of all, it doesn't happen, and you don't want it. The get rich slowly in terms of housing is apt as well as for stock markets and everything else under the sun. So I think it's where a cooling off would actually be a sort of a pause that refreshes, if that's not stealing someone's punchline from somewhere else. But a bit of a housing cooling would be a good thing. It actually sustains the cycle more if we have a bit of a pause as well, which would again filter into that expectation of better economic times through the course of next year.
Yeah, so I was trying to think with a 10-year horizon when it comes to housing or investing, because as we've seen over the last couple of years, a lot can happen in 2 years that you weren't expecting, good and bad. It's a lot less pressure and a lot more relaxing if you think medium to longer term. So, Steve, thank you so much for coming back on. It's always great to have you and always a popular guest. So look forward to catching up again soon. Cheers.
See you soon, Pete. Thanks very much. That was great fun. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Pete's Property Podcast, powered by Buyers. Don't forget to subscribe and join us next time as Pete chats all things property with a new guest. And just a reminder that the information provided in this podcast is general advice only and doesn't take into account your personal financial situation or needs. You should always consult a licensed professional to discuss your individual personal circumstances.